Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to our Thursday morning briefing series. This is the first edition after the summer. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, we will once again look at Ukraine for several reasons and from several angles. The Kursk incursion and its implications, Russia's revenge, a barrage of airstrikes, hundreds of missiles and drones, and Russian gains in Pokrovsk and Donetsk Oblast. The devastating consequences for Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure and the economy. And amid these difficult circumstances, also President Zelensky's options and the political path forward, both with regard to Western support and domestic reforms in Ukraine itself. All of this is happening against the backdrop of developments in the West that make the support of Ukraine increasingly tricky. On the one side, of course, the upcoming US election and the potential deadlock of the US government between September and January. On the other hand, in Germany, the regional elections in Eastern Germany coming up this weekend that are expected to result in victories for the Alternative for Germany, AfD, the German extreme right opposition party advocating pro-Russian foreign policy. So what are we to expect this autumn in Ukraine on the front lines, in Western capitals and beyond? There could be no better panel than the four speakers that I'm about to introduce. First will be Ms. Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, who is a member of Parliament, the Verkhovna Rada for European Solidarity Parliamentary Group in Ukraine. From 2016 to 2019, she was Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine on matters of European integration. And prior to her political career, she worked in civil society and journalism, amongst others, as Washington correspondent of the Ukraine service of BBC Radio. Good morning, Ivanna. Next will be our own Dr. András, who is a senior research fellow at DGAP's Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. András focuses on Russia's foreign, security, and defense policy, and is a very loyal contributor to this morning briefing series. Welcome back, András.
Good morning.
After that, we'll turn to Julia Soldiato-Westerwald, who's a research fellow at the EU and Global Affairs Unit at Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands. She focused on post-war reconstruction and security sector reforms in Ukraine and Ukraine's EU integration process. She has in the past advised national and local governments in Eastern Partnership countries, including Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. Good morning.
Last and certainly but not least, Dr. Oksana Huss, who is a policy analyst and in the Public Governance Directorate at OECD, which you can well see in the background of her screen. She is also a research associate at the University of Bologna and focuses on anti-corruption, social movements, Ukrainian domestic politics. She has in the past advised organizations, including the Council of Europe, the EU, and UNESCO. Welcome, Oksana. Before we begin, just a very few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and that we will upload a copy of this subsequently. We will kick off our conversation here on the panel in just a moment with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then we will open things up for Q&A after about 30 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And when invited to speak, keep your questions or comments relatively brief so we can take up as many as possible. You're also welcome to use the chat, although we really appreciate live interaction here on the panel. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues supporting this morning briefing series, including Milan Nitsch, Henning Hoff, Uriel Weber, Helga Beck, and many others. And now, without much further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. Can you give us an idea of the situation in Kiev at the moment, political, military, and also personal, perhaps? Over to you, Ivanna.
Good morning. Thank you very much for invitation. Thank you for doing all these briefings, and I am also appreciative of the interest that this briefing is gathering as well. Well, obviously, the situation is not getting any easier for people in Ukraine, and this night was another attack of the Russian Federation over many regions of Ukraine, including Kyiv. So that's another sleepless night for many Ukrainians and for definitely for our air defense and for our forces of defense as such. we can, we can focus on some positive developments over this summer that have brought additional mobilization internally with regard to our future, such as opening of the negotiations with the European Union, which we are extremely grateful for. And we are hoping that this magnifying lens of attention of the European Union to the internal situation in Ukraine will also provide us with opportunities to deliver better on the important changes inside the Ukraine. We could focus on the needs, the urgent needs of the energy infrastructure and the repairs that are critical in order to go through winter period, because obviously this coming winter is going to be extremely difficult because of all the destruction that Russia has already inserted upon us, but also might still get inserted in the future. Or we can talk about economic policies that also need a very serious attention, because there is a dire need to increase the resources that are available internally inside of the country to finance the war effort, but at the same time, we also understand that this is a very serious dependency that Ukraine does have right now on the support of our partners with regard to direct budgetary support for Ukraine. However, I would just say a couple of words with regard to the military situation, how it is impacting the political situation, both internally and externally, because I'm sure that everybody is watching very attentively the whole situation in Kursk region, the Kursk operation of Ukraine, and is also, as you have mentioned, Jan, at the very beginning, is also thinking that all this rocket and drone attacks of the Russian Federation are a revenge to what has happened in the Kursk region. But I would underline that we do have to look at this, at all of this events in complex, and we should not treat the latest Russian attacks as revenge, because otherwise we would have to believe that the whole so-called special military operation, as Russia calls its war against Ukraine, is some type of revenge. But then the question is, revenge to what? Just a small reminder that back in 2014, Ukraine was a neutral state, and Russia has started its attack on Ukraine when it just believed that it can reach its objectives that it set for itself. And the objectives are, as the usual Russian national policy is over centuries, is conquering and occupying other territories, as opposed to focusing on its own internal matters. So I think that we have to understand that all these latest attacks are not any type of revenge, and this is just following the mythical vision of a Russian ruler, that Ukraine has to be subordinated to Russian Federation, and that Ukraine does not have the right to exist in his eyes. And this is following his ego. It's nothing even about realpolitik or any other real policy objectives. I think it's about Putin being willing to explain to his, or to prove to his people that he is a great ruler, that he is a politician of world caliber, and he does not even care that much about his internationally recognized borders of his country and his own territory, but he cares much more about conquering, occupying yet another city in the east of Ukraine, which is Pokrovsk, and where he has focused most of his military might at this particular point. I think that this definitely leads us to understanding that the Kursk operation at this moment has led to strengthening of the Ukrainian potential negotiating position, but at the same time also it has proven that Ukraine can turn this chessboard, not only in a diplomatic terms, but also in military terms. And that also leads us to understanding that unfortunately we are seeing that Putin understands that he does not have any he clearly understands, even that though he says something totally different, that he doesn't have any threat from NATO. We could see that even from Kaliningrad region, the military units have been withdrawn to be brought to Kursk region to counter Ukrainian forces there, and that means that Putin doesn't see any red lines and doesn't see any risks for himself. From my point of view, this leads us to the biggest political challenge that we still have for Ukrainian politicians, for Ukrainian authorities, is to persuade the West that it's time to get from the escalation management policy to the policy of being ready for Russian defeat and having the understanding that Russian Federation cannot be agreed upon on anything, and that means that there has to be a change in the approach. There has to be a change in the approach with regard to letting Ukraine hitting the military targets inside the Russian Federation with the long-range missiles of our partners, and that means that yes, Ukraine will at some point produce its own additional longer range weaponry, as President Zelensky has announced that we are in the process of this, besides the drones that have been already hitting some military targets in the territory of the Russian Federation. But the question is the time, and the question is when this all will happen, and how much destruction and how much occupation will happen in between that. So I think that at this particular moment, it is about the major challenge to change the thinking, not only internally in Ukraine, but also, or rather externally among our partners, what are the end results of this war and what they should be and how we can reach them together.
Thank you so much, Ivanna, for this overview. And I would love to hear from you in the Q&A later on what you think about the way forward, including the victory plan that President Zelensky has announced to be discussing in the US soon. But before that, I want to hand things over to András and turn to the military side of things. Perhaps you could help us, András, to explain the Kursk incursion as well as Russia's moves on Pokrovsk. What's your assessment of the most recent situation? And I think you will be sharing a map as well to underline your commentary. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you again for joining us today morning. And yes, as usual, I'm trying to share a map. We will rely on the maps produced by the Institute for the Study of War, the map we usually use. So right now you are supposed to see a map of Ukraine's Kursk region. Do you see a map? Good.
Yes. Yes.
So this is the present state of Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region. Right now, Ukraine controls approximately 1,000 square kilometers of territory. And the speed of Ukraine's advance into the Kursk region is slowing down. Ukraine apparently stabilizing its hold over the territory. On the one hand, one shall not overestimate the size and importance of this territory and the Ukrainian forces engaged. Just to give you a scale, the Kursk region alone is 30,000 square kilometers. Ukraine controls roughly 1,000. Second, the Ukrainian forces engaged in this incursion are not more than 4, maximum 5 brigades, plus a few independent battalions. So something around 18,000 soldiers, and not all of them are fighting. Just as a comparison, the Russian contingent attacking Pokrovsk and all around the Donbas front is way above 100,000. Why I'm telling all this? There is a discussion that all the Ukrainian incursion to Kursk is diverting vital resources from the defenses in the Donbas. Colleagues, the scales are different. The scale is simply different. The Kursk incursion, in terms of the forces involved, is a relatively small thing compared to the Russian advance in the Donbas. However, when it comes to the political aspects, it's way more significant. First, one needs to realize the territory of the Russian Federation, I mean, Russia's internationally recognized territory, has not been occupied ever since the Second World War. So that's a major inconvenience, not to say defeat, for the Russian regime, that Ukraine holds parts of the Kursk region. Second, on the 8th of September, 8th of September is the United Election Days in Russia. As you know, the Russian public administration system is composed of very many layers, and every year in early September, there are regional elections, governor elections, city Duma elections, lot different types of elections. Fun fact, on the 8th of September, in the Kursk region, they should elect a governor. And that's a major inconvenience to hold elections when part of the region is actually under Ukrainian occupation. So politically, this incursion reached indeed, the attention of the wider Russian public. This is bigger in terms of significance, so the Russian propaganda cannot deny it, cannot concede it. Plus, it also achieved important military successes. It forced Russia to divert quite many units from the other front lines in Ukraine, from Zaporizhia, from the Kherson front line, also from the Kharkiv front line, not yet from the Donbass. Besides, Ukraine has taken at least 500 to 700 prisoners, which is an important achievement. To give you a scale, so far, altogether in 8 months of war, there have been around 3,000 prisoners exchanged, slightly less than 3,000. So compared to that, capturing several hundred new Russian prisoners of war is indeed an important achievement. Last things about Kursk, what Ukraine is not going to do. Ukraine will definitely not reach the city of Kursk. Russians are protecting the road, here I'm pointing, with the best forces they have. It's extremely unlikely that Ukraine would get as far as Kursk, not to mention that it wouldn't make much sense. Second, Ukraine is not going to reach the Kursk nuclear power plant either. The power plant is somewhat west of Kursk at the city of Kurchatov. It's still relatively far away from the front line, and Russians will not let the power plant fall under Ukrainian control. And again, why on earth would Ukraine need a power plant? So this incursion will stay limited in terms of size and scale. Ukraine is in the move of stabilizing the territory it holds. If we move to other front line, which was already mentioned, Pokrovsk, as Minister Klympush-Tsintsadze mentioned, here the situation is dire. The Russian army, this is the Pokrovsk map, the Russian army is in the process of approaching Pokrovsk. There is no way to stop them before they reach the city. So what is going to happen? A long siege is going to happen, because Pokrovsk is a major city, dear colleagues. Before the war, it had an official population of 60,000, but together with all the refugees, it was closer to 80,000. Roughly half of the civilians are still in the city. And Ukraine is going to defend this city. Ukraine has constructed strong fortifications inside and around Pokrovsk, so another long siege is coming. Pokrovsk will slow down the Russians, possibly stop them, but the same dire fate is awaiting Pokrovsk, like what happened to Bakhmut, like what happened to Avdiivka, like what's happening to Chasiv Yar. So long, bloody siege is coming. It's extremely unlikely that the Russian forces could take Pokrovsk anytime soon, even this year. So here, Pokrovsk marks the, how to say, like the northwestern boundary of Russia's advance, but a long, bloody siege is coming with terrible humanitarian consequences. So this is what's awaiting Pokrovsk and the region here. And as Minister Klympush-Tsintsadze already said, few more things. Russia already for the third night in a row keeps launching massive air attacks against Ukraine using both drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and other weapon systems. Good news here. While the damage inflicted to Ukraine's infrastructure is significant, the performance of Ukraine's air defense has been rapidly improving. This is partially thanks to the more and more Western weapons arriving, air defense weapons, but also to the deployment of the F-16s into combating the incoming drones and cruise missiles. So Ukraine's air defense has been performing a lot better than it has done in the spring or during the summer, and this is indeed good news. When it comes to the F-16s, one shall not overestimate their importance yet. Ukraine has less than a dozen fully trained pilots for the F-16s. A bit more aircrafts and more aircrafts will come by the end of the year, but so far the number of fully trained pilots is very limited. So Ukraine is not in the situation to take any risks, meaning that F-16s for quite a while will be used more for air defense purposes against drones and cruise missiles, and not for supporting the operation of the frontline troops. Last thing on Belarus. Belarus has been moving some troops along the border with Ukraine, but this is more an informational operation, not a military threat. The number of the Belarusian forces moved to the border is below 1,500. They have roughly 24 tanks, 36 armored personnel carriers, some artillery, but this contingent, even combined, is not enough for even smallly penetrating Ukraine's border. One needs to understand Ukraine has extremely well fortified the border with Belarus in the last 2 years. Plus, the Belarusian army lacks some decisive capabilities necessary for any kind of attack. So this is more like a show than any kind of real military preparation. The likely objective is to force Ukraine to divert some of its troops from the Donbas and from Kursk to the Belarusian border. But of course, Ukraine knows the weaknesses of the Belarusian army very well. So this information operation doesn't seem to work too well. And I think this is going to stay like this. So that's it from me for the moment. I stop sharing. And if you happen to have any questions, I'm trying my best to answer them. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much for answering so many of the questions that I had, and I'm sure we'll come back to more. But for now, let me hand over to Julia and ask what the political prospects are, given the military situation that András has just painted.
Well, thank you, Jan, and thank you to all those who are tuning in this morning. Yes, I would like to highlight a few main trends that we observe with regard to the EU integration process and where Ukraine stands now, and then zoom in specifically on the justice reform, security sector reform and reconstruction. So over the summer, Ukraine's government have been preparing for bilateral consultations on the screening process with the European Commission that will starting this September. The screening process starts with the fundamental clusters, and the main topics on the agenda are the rule of law roadmap for justice, judiciary reform, fundamental rights, law enforcement, fight against corruption, and administrative reform. So following the screening, European Commission will draft a screening report, which is an assessment of the level of alignment of the Ukrainian legislation with the EU key law and policies, and then prepare an implementation. Ukraine will prepare an implementation plan, which is the roadmap. Multiple roadmaps actually, and based on that, the benchmarks will be and conditionality is related to that will be established. So what Ukrainian government is working on now is basically two tasks at the same time. They are preparing the presentations for the screening process, but also already drafting a roadmap ahead of time to be better prepared and to do it quicker. This creates a lot of time pressure and high demand for substantive and process expertise, which is on Ukrainian side and a big issue. The challenge is now how to draft this high quality rule of law roadmap, because the keys are not really specific, not really clear on chapter 23. So while in chapter 24, and that's the law enforcement, fundamental rights, and fight against corruption, it is more or less clear what needs to be done. It's mostly about adopting certain directives. In chapter 23 is an open book, and because every country has a slightly different legislative judicial system, and hence the criteria and the reform points will be different for every country. So for that, what we are also receiving a lot of requests for substantive expertise and a lot of questions how to do it right. So it's the process. This process will go well. In the beginning of the next year, a new cluster will be opened and internal market reform. So the general trend with regard to the EU integration is that Ukraine's government want to be prepared ahead of time and already train broader civil servants who are engaged in the negotiation framework to be prepared for the next steps. And there is a general sense of continuous time pressure as Ukraine is eager to get the EU accession process moving as quickly as possible, because it differently or in difference with, for example, how the EU integration process went in the Balkan countries, Ukraine has this factor of war, and the sense that EU accession will also have influence on the sense of security in Ukraine. In terms of reconstruction, priority remains with the preparation for the winter heating season. Estimates suggest now that up to 70% of Ukraine's energy generation capacity has been damaged or destroyed. With the intensive shelling over the past few days, this percentage may be even bigger. And the general aim of the Ukrainian government now is to reduce the heat consumption by 50 billion kilowatt per year. To reduce, that is for private households, to reduce the dependence on the natural gas. And recently the government has signed a memorandum with the regional authorities, because they're responsible mostly for heating stations, to ensure that this will happen already this winter. At the same time, the government is also currently implementing many different energy efficiency programs aiming at increasing the number of thermally modernized buildings and solar power plants that can be installed. There are loans and grants, small loans and grants available for that. But the practical implementation of this is not without the challenges. Installing solar power plants is already happening on a large scale, but it's still not available for every category of the population due to also administrative technical issues. And so this is with regard to the energy supply to households. And another priority is scaling up Ukrainian defense companies. And in light of shortages of electricity, one of the main priorities for the coming winter is to ensure that there will be enough uninterrupted energy supply for its strategic production sectors, for both defense, but also manufacturing, and that are supporting the Ukrainian economy. So all available fossil fuel resources will be directed to this area, to industry. German Federal Agency for Technical Assistance will be supporting Ukraine in thinking of and implementing emergency solutions for increasing energy supply. And the last point that I wanted to mention is with regard to reconstruction is that the government of Ukraine has approved amendments to the state strategy for regional development that goes up to 2027. It's a state regional policy, and it is now more aligned with the European Union cohesion policy. That is important for Ukraine because its aim is to better address equal recovery of different regions in Ukraine. And the key sectors of this strategy are focused on the reintegration of veterans with their families and restoration of infrastructure. Another focus or priority with regards to the reconstruction on the local level is further development of institutional financial capacity of the local governments in order to generate a local economic development, to support their businesses, and to increase successful rate of applications, for example, for international projects under construction.
Thank you, Julia. This was already quite a lot in terms of what needs to be done even under the restraints of war. And perhaps we could zoom in on some of those reforms needed to make Ukraine fit for Western integration and go forward on a promising economic and political path. And so let me hand over to Oksana now, last but certainly not least, for your comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Jan. Also, thank you for organizing this discussion. Actually, I would like to zoom out a little bit from what Julia was saying to provide you an overview in general. The Office of Reforms under the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, they created a reforms matrix, and I'm sharing with you the link in the chat that you can have a look. This is a very helpful tool because it kind of merges and generates everything, all conditionality and main documents that define Ukraine's reform priorities. So basically on one page, you can see what Ukraine will be doing in the next year or two, in the next short and midterm prospects. A little comment on this. So this reform matrix is structured in line with 4 documents. So one is the EU recommendations for Ukraine's candidate status. This is more like political reforms. And in other three documents, they are connected to economic survival of Ukraine, so to say. So the second document is Ukraine facility, financial support, and then IMF and World Bank loan conditions. So basically you can see what kind of shapes now and incentivizes the steps of Ukraine's government, and also which are the steps of the Ukraine's government. I would like to make here two arguments. So first, on the political side of the EU integration, and Julia just described brilliantly the process, how the next steps will be in the process. But what I would like to highlight that it would be wrong and quite frustrating to only reduce EU's integration of Ukraine to the negotiation process that is starting now. Because EU integration has started already much earlier, especially in 2014 when the Ukraine Association Agreement has been adopted and it entered into force, but also recognizing such initiatives like regional integration with the Danube EU strategy or European research area, and. So there are many examples where Ukraine is actually already in the process and entering the EU, and there are already results to show for both sides in the communication how important is Ukraine's EU integration for the EU and for Ukraine. So this is really important to highlight, because the negotiation process is causing a lot of challenges in terms of capacity, in terms of knowledge on both sides, actually, because also the EU needs certain adjustments to extend its capability to embrace new candidates and new countries. So it's on both sides a process that goes on the limit age, and this is why it's even more important to highlight what has been done before in terms of integration and how important those steps are and what are the results of those. And the second argument I would like to make is about the economic focus on the reforms. So in all this matrix of the reforms, for those of you who were able to check the website, you will see very quickly that there are indicators to measure the outcomes of the reforms, and both of them are connected to economy, to economic development. And this is this way of welfare thinking in the Western world that we have, which is absolutely fine, but I would like to refer to what Ivanna was saying in the beginning, the need for change in this global thinking. So we are facing now new challenges, and much more security is coming into front, but also, as Jan was saying in his introduction, all the democratic forces in power, they are not self-evident anymore, and more we have such parties like AfD in Germany coming into front, also in other countries. So there are other constraints than economy and welfare only, and I'm a bit cautious and a bit concerned of connecting all the reforms in Ukraine that needs to be done to economic argument only. And especially in face of Ukraine's resilience that the country was showing. So OECD published, Sigma program conducted a review of public administration, and it was published early this year, and it highlighted the resilience of public administration in Ukraine, but also in the society. We all know how strong Ukraine was withstanding, especially in the first months of the war. And there are other aspects than economy contributing to this resilience, and this resilience must be definitely maintained. And I would like to highlight here 3 points. So one, again, focus on democratic and integrity frameworks, especially because the elections in Ukraine are halted in the period of a wartime because of the Russians' full-scale invasion. It's basically impossible to make the elections in the country. And even more, it is important to kind of strengthen all the good governance mechanisms and integrity frameworks to maintain democratic legitimacy in the country. And the second point is the social cohesion. So paying attention to all the grassroots movements, grassroots support that is in the country, so that not only top-down level reforms are in the focus, but also that support of the local level and society is also on the map. And the final point that Ukrainian decentralization reform was quite important, and there is a lot of also scientific evidence showing that it contributed to the resilience of the country. And it's quite natural process in any crisis that there is a decentralization of decision making. So it's easier, for example, for the donors in the crisis to go to the office of the president and decide with one focal point what has to be done and what are the priorities. But it doesn't mean that all the local level has to be neglected because of that. So one argument that is always in the debate that local level in Ukraine doesn't have sufficient capacities to maintain all the infrastructure and public services. But exactly for this reason, it's not the point to kind of dismiss this level or to make it weak, but the opposite, to strengthen the capacities. And I will stop for now here and hope that look forward to the questions you're having.
Thank you so much, Oksana, and thanks to all of our speakers on the panel. Since we are already well past 9 o'clock, it's time for our audience to come in with questions, and I'd like to encourage everyone to raise your hands and join with questions and comments or contribute in the chat. As our oh, we've got a question right there. I'll keep my own one back and take the question by Klaus Wittmann. If you could please say who you are and address your question to one or several panelists.
Good morning. I'm Klaus Wittmann, member of the DGAP and former general of the Bundeswehr. I teach contemporary history at Potsdam University. I think Kursk, the Kursk invasion has shattered the myth of Russian invincibility. And I'm fighting on the media front constantly that now the German government should overcome the escalation fear and what I call self-deterrence and make decisions with regard to systems like Taurus and also with regard to the limitations on the use of Western weapons. And I would like to hear from the experts in light of talks going on in Brussels yesterday, the NATO-Ukraine Council, today EU foreign ministers, how do you see the chances for Germany and for that matter also the United States to go forward in a more courageous way regarding these two aspects, systems and restrictions? And quite different questions. Who of you knows something about the ballistic missile test that was mentioned by President Zelensky? What kind of system that is?
Thank you so much for these questions, which I think are for our first two speakers respectively. So please, Minister Klympush, if you would like to go first and then András.
Yes, well, with regard to this latest meetings of NATO-Ukraine Council and the meeting of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the EU, I don't think that we are expecting any breakthroughs with the decisions on behalf of our Western partners, unfortunately. And that is something that is frustrating Ukrainians. I allow myself to mention that back in March, end of March of 2022, I was in one of the first delegations, basically the first delegation from the Ukrainian parliament that went to the United States. And we at that point already were talking about F-16s. And our argument was that there will be a time when the US will give us the permission to get the F-16s. And maybe that's already the time to start training our pilots. We have actually lost more than 2 years when the decision was taken and when the initial preparations and trainings have happened with regard to the pilots and maintenance teams and so on. So unfortunately, I think that we will get this permission, but this permission both with regard to longer range missiles, not only about Tauruses, but also about different type of storm shadows, probably from the UK, and also the permission to hit the military targets inside the Russian Federation. But again, the time and the cost, human cost, destruction cost, is going to grow immensely within this period of time. And the tide has changed yet with regard to Western thinking. There is still a lot of fearfulness from the nuclear power that is attacking a smaller state.
Thank you. András, would you like to comment as well?
Thank you. Thank you, General Wittmann. When it comes to the perspective of the West lifting some of the restrictions on the use of systems and the selection of targets deep inside Russia, I do not expect much change, at least until the US elections coming. Simply because even for those weapon systems like the Storm Shadow, which is a British-French design, London and Paris still needs the consent of the United States to use these weapon systems against Russian territory, simply because of the intelligence and targeting elements of deploying these weapons. So I do not expect much of these red lines getting lifted before the US elections. On the other hand, it means like 2.5 months more. So taking into account that the war has been going on for more than 28 months, and there have been several red lines, which seemed to be firm in the beginning, but right now they have already vanished. I think in medium run, this red line will also vanish, but not in the short time. To give you, I mean, you all remember the debate about providing Ukraine with tanks. People were afraid that would lead to escalation. It didn't. Tanks are already there. As Minister Klympush-Tsintsadze mentioned, the same thing with the F-16s. So many people were worried that providing Ukraine with F-16s would lead to escalation. F-16s are there, more are to come, still no escalation. So I think the similar thing will happen also to the long-range weaponry, but not immediately. When it comes to the new Ukrainian ballistic missile, this is the Krim or Grom #2. The Krim is not a new system. This has been developed already before the war, but the development process slowed down because of different prioritization, shortage of resources, all that. It's a fairly advanced short-range ballistic missile system. The big question is not only its capabilities, but also the number. I mean, how many such Krim 2s Ukraine has operational. But still, it's an important development. And if production could be scaled up, possibly with some external support, this would be a significant change in Ukraine's domestic ability to strike targets deep inside the territory of the Russian Federation. So it's a big thing, but again, it's not a Wunderwaffe. A lot depends on the number of the available Krim 2 missiles. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to both of you. There's another question in the chat by Jan Eichhorn, which I think is addressed to you, András, about whether the Kursk invasion is succeeding to achieve its intended goal of capturing significant attention from the Russian military. And if I might add another follow-up question myself, I read a recent commentary article in Foreign Affairs magazine that someone saying talking about the false promise of potential Ukrainian deep strikes into Russian territory. So I wonder to what extent you think those weapons and systems would make a difference strategically in the future. And if I can pick up another question in the chat on energy security in Central Europe, which is probably more addressed to you, Oksana, and or Julia as well. So why don't we start in reverse order this time and go Oksana, Julia, and András.
I don't have specific information on the sanctions in Ukraine regarding Rosneft or other companies. But in general, on the energy security in Europe, I think what is happening now with energy insecurity in Ukraine, and if Ukraine finds the solution for this winter to provide for energy, this will be quite innovative and quite innovative solutions in terms of decentralized grids of energy supply. And this is something that can contribute to the energy security in Europe if followed the logic and governance, I mean, of such a decentralized systems, because this is something that Europe is lacking quite a lot. And when the Russian full-scale invasion started, actually this energy insecurity was one of the main arguments why not supporting Ukraine or why not sanctioning Russia. And this is why I think that Ukraine is now under very difficult conditions, is the country that is producing innovations that might be helpful for other countries as well. But I have no comment on the sanctions specifically. Maybe Julia knows something more.
Before I hand over to Julia, let me just throw in an addendum to that question, perhaps, because energy security is, as we know, not only linked to the economic state of things, but also to public opinion, and this reflects both countries in all over Europe and Ukraine itself. And we've seen it in Germany, of course, about energy prices in the past. So I'm wondering what energy questions, what sort of impact they have on the political mood, both in Ukraine, in Central and Eastern Europe in general. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you. So the initial shock that Central Europe and Western Europe has experienced 2 years ago on the energy supply will not likely repeat again in that scale. And this winter, for example, for instance, as well, because there has been already a number of measures taken to replenish, to change the structure of import of natural energy resources and further advanced transition of renewable resources. The last contracts with importing Russian gas, for example, are ending at the end of the year on the European, like pan-European level. And Ukraine is also agreed with the European Union and Moldova to finish, to close down the transit of the natural gas to Moldova, which is also taking place between September and end of the year. I'm not sure specifically on the date right now, but this is something. And yes, the European Union is a net importer of the fossil fuels. And Ukraine is often mentioned as a potential exporter in the future, or like the country that could export a lot to the European Union. But I would not say that there is a direct link between the destruction of current energy facilities and immediate danger for the energy security to countries like Czechia, for example. Yeah, that I will stop here.
Thank you. There were 2 more questions addressed to András before I hand over to Ivanna Klympush. I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. I try to be quick. When it comes to the question whether the Kursk offensive achieved the objective of getting Russia's military attention or forcing Russia to divert some units from other front lines, the answer is a partial yes. So the likely Ukrainian objective was to force Russia to divert units from the Pokrovsk direction, so thereby decrease the pressure on the Ukrainian units defending Pokrovsk. This so far has not materialized. Russia clearly prioritizes the Pokrovsk offensive, so has not diverted much forces from there. But, and this is the success part from the Ukrainian side, it has diverted plenty of units from the other front lines. So the intensity of the Russian offensives or fighting in the Zaporizhia front line, even in the Kharkiv front line and the southern part of the Donetsk front line, as well as at the Kremina, has been decreasing. So partially this offensive has reached this objective as well. When it comes to the question of deep strikes on against Russian territory, whether it would have a strategic effect, of course, yes. I mean, if Ukraine had enough weapons that could reach targets in a distance of 300 to 500 kilometers, it would mean that Russian combat helicopters would be basically banned from the front line because all their airports could be in the range of Ukraine's ballistic missiles. The same goes for logistical targets, the same goes for artillery depots, and the same goes for certain crucial bridges as well. So long-range, domestically developed Ukrainian strike capabilities, if available in significant numbers, could indeed change the balance in favor of Ukraine. Again, it depends really on the numbers. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these insights. Let me hand over back to Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. So you had comments as well.
Yeah, just real quick on the energy security question. It's a complex of different things that have to be done both by the government of Ukraine, inside of Ukraine, including the decentralization effort that, as Oksana was referring to. But at the same time, it's also about increase of the import capabilities from the European Union, and that is something that is still being discussed between the EU and Ukraine, and I don't think that it will drastically impact the energy security inside the European Union, including in the eastern part of it. That's one thing, but also it's about financing the equipment buying to restore some of the thermal power stations capabilities. And we are talking, obviously, we are talking about Green Deal, about the alternative energy sources. But in order to go through this winter, in order to go to we have to understand the energy security will remain a structural issue for the nearest couple of winters and years for Ukraine. So therefore, we have to restore also the capabilities, if they are possible to restore, of the thermal power stations that are allowing to balance the energy grids, and that are allowing to balance the atomic power stations production of the energy, and all the alternative sources of energy which are not possible to balance without either hydro power stations or thermal power stations. And that is the challenge that the government has right now. And there is also a serious pressure on the government, and there are some questions with regard to the coordination and management capacity and the governance capacity that the Ukrainian government is taking up on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ivanna. Coming back to one of the questions I raised in the beginning about the so-called victory plan that President Zelensky has announced and wants to discuss in the US in the weeks ahead, I wanted to ask you, Ivanna, about your opinion and your expectations for this, if you want.
Again, I agree with András. He was mentioning that not much changes will be happening before the presidential elections in the US. So I do not expect that even with any presentation of anything that could be seen as an additional more specific plan from the Ukrainian side, there will be a change of policy in the US before the elections and before the end of this year. So I do not expect that any of the initiatives and any of the strategies that Ukrainian side might present either to the US or to our European partners will change their type of thinking in the nearest couple of months.
Thanks a lot. We only have about 5 minutes left, and there are several more questions coming up in the chat, which I would like to invite our speakers to read and pick up themselves, as I am already inviting for a final round of comments, because we have to close on time in about 5 minutes. So please feel free to pick up any questions in the chat that you feel are addressed to yourself. And if you will, also, looking at the title of today's briefing, we want to talk about the political and military path ahead. And if you could just give our audience a sense of what you think where things will stand about 4 to 6 weeks time from now, if you were to make similar comments again as today, where do you expect developments will go? So an invitation to pick up any questions that are left out there in the chat, a look ahead, a sort of preview exercise, and please also feel free to react to one another's comments. And for this final round, I think it's probably best to go in reverse order, and then so Oksana, Julia, András, and with Ivanna.
Thank you, Jan. Well, my actual area of expertise is, as you said, anti-corruption and integrity, and I'm privileged to coordinate the anti-corruption and integrity review that OECD is doing in Ukraine. And maybe regarding the tendencies and the prospects, well, we see that in the last year, since 2015, Ukraine developed a remarkable institutional anti-corruption system with strong legislation and strong institutions that are capable to detect corruption and also prosecute corruption. And now what is upcoming, we see the mainstreaming of these processes into other governmental agencies, ministries. So basically that anti-corruption is not only an island of several institutions, but that this is a way of doing things in every ministry. So in fact, the business process is defined by the integrity, and this is where OECD is trying to contribute to the upcoming challenges that are connected to this mainstreaming of integrity and anti-corruption.
Thanks a lot for your perspective, Oksana. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. I would like to reflect on one of the questions on the outcome endgame of the war. So to start with, a term that is usually often used in an international negotiations world is a mutually hurling stalemate. And that's when both parties of the conflict are do not see any benefits to continue military actions, and that's the moment when usually the countries are considering negotiations. So at a certain point of time, both Ukraine and Russia are not at that point yet, and we will. I expect the recent counter-operation in Kursk has certainly strengthened Ukrainian negotiation position, and Ukraine is pushing a path of sectoral negotiations, which are already ongoing for some time and focused on exchange of prisoners, war prisoners. On well, in the past, on the grain dialogue, for example, they can be extended to, for example, security of navigation on the sea and perhaps even security of the ports. So that's the kind of path that is more likely we can see in the future, as opposed to the comprehensive peace process or negotiation process on all issues at the same time. That's I guess what I wanted to say with regard to that. And yeah, so what remains crucial for Ukraine in the coming months is the leverage of ammunition and weapons that are already kind of promised by the Ukraine's partners. And indeed, what has been discussed here a lot is get out the limitations on the use of the long range weapons. And if I may, a quick question to Mr. András, Dr. András Rácz, about what is happening in Kursk. You mentioned that for Ukraine, in terms of military forces, the loss is not that substantial. The scale is small, but for Russia, it is bigger. So I was just wondering, and on your perspective on that, usually for offensive, you need like 4 times as more military forces than for defensive. How do you see that? Is it proportional, the number of forces that Ukraine has to divert and the number of forces that Russia needs to divert as well? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, András.
Thank you. To Julia's question, Ukraine planned and conducted this Kursk offensive masterfully because Kursk was very weakly defended. There were mostly FSB units, Rosgvardia units, some police forces, and some very minor military units, which didn't even defend, rather monitor the border. So Ukraine could very quickly go in and go deep. If Russia is preparing to push the Ukrainian forces out, but only very slowly. Russians would need 40 to 50,000 soldiers to push Ukraine out of the Kursk region. They are doing this concentration of forces, but it's going on very, very slowly. And once Ukraine decides to get out of the Kursk region, because sooner or later Ukraine will get out of the Kursk region, they will surely do their best to make it very hard for the Russians to come back. You know, mining, blowing up crucial infrastructure, so to slow down the possibility of the Russians to retake the region. But again, this is not going to be quick. Ukraine is right now cementing in its positions, doing fortification works, stabilizing its hold over the territory. So this the fighting in the Kursk region will go on for several more weeks, possibly months. And to Jan's question about the short-term outlook, basically until the US presidential election. So fighting in the Kursk region will continue. Russia will keep prioritizing the Pokrovsk direction. The siege of Pokrovsk will start. It will last for a long time. Meanwhile, Ukraine will keep training its new slightly more than 10 brigades, as well as train new F-16 pilots and keep developing its domestic defense industry, all in the preparation for larger operations to come next year. Meaning, I fully agree with Julia, we are not yet at the point when any of the sides would be ready to resign from military tools and means. Instead, both sides are still concentrating on reaching their objectives by the means of military power. So the war is going to continue.
I agree with everything that my colleagues have, co-panelists have been saying, and maybe just add a little bit more urgency of understanding with the situation in the energy field, because if we do not restore our capacity, if we do not prepare for the winter, and we have very short period of time, it's weeks period of time in the nearest, that means that unfortunately we might get into another very serious situation with the blow to economy of Ukraine. That's one thing, and also with the additional wave of refugees outside of the country. And that is something that definitely not Ukraine is not interested in, and we would like to prevent, and that's why the urgency of this matter has to be prioritized, I also think, on the level of our partners. And one short answer to the question that was asked with regard to the EU committee and the Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine, how engaged it is in the process of formulating this roadmaps with regard to chapters 23 and 24 on fundamentals. The Rada is rather focusing on its monitoring and oversight capacity, and is expecting from the government to prepare the roadmap. And I hope that we will go commonly through the scrutinizing this roadmap in order to get to the best possible solution. We still have to improve both the internal capacity of the government through the public administration reform, and also the internal capacity of the Parliament of Ukraine as well, in order to deal with all the tasks that we have ahead of us in terms of European integration. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivanna, and thanks everyone on the panel for your excellent input and the questions indeed as well. We will come back to these questions here at DGAP in the morning briefing series in the future. Next week, we will be looking at the regional elections in Germany that were mentioned earlier today. We will also turn to the US election and to other issues in current international affairs. But this morning briefing series started in February 2022 with the Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine, and we will, of course, keep updating you on it. So thanks everyone very much for tuning in. Have a wonderful day, despite the serious situations, and see you next week.